Well, I was living in Chicago, and I had my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Illinois Tech, and I got drafted towards the tail end of the Korean conflict, and I did my basic training in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, I called it, and most of my basic training class did get shipped to Korea. But the Army was having difficulty at that time in recruiting engineers into Huntsville, Alabama. But the Army, being the Army, they waved their arms, and about 200 of us showed up. Young GI engineers from all around the country. And I understand in history it started in 1950. So there were about 3 different groups of 150, 200 GI engineers that came here, and I was in the last group beginning in 1955. So I really worked with the Army for 5 years, 55 to 60. The first 2 years was as a GI and then as a civilian. And I worked in manufacturing, production engineering. The thing was really getting more busy as we went along. And actually, a couple of years with the Army, I became a supervisor. I was running the planning organization, production manufacturing plans, and I even had the opportunity at one point to present to a Major General, Air Force General Ostrander, who was from ARPA, Advanced Research Project Agency, and he had requested a briefing on a manufacturing plan for the very first Saturn I first stage, the clustered vehicle, which we call Cluster's Last Stand. It had a center tank, which was a Jupiter tank surrounded by 8 Redstone tanks and powered by 8 Jupiter engines. And anyway, I made that presentation, and that turned out to be rather good for my career in a way, because we had all the superstructure from the Marshall Center, or still the Army, ABMA, came down to be my backup and answer questions from General Ostrander. The Redstone and Jupiter were what was really being worked on when I first came here, Redstone particularly. And we had a real production line set up on Redstones out in building 4705. And that continued on, because when you went to the first Saturn I stage, I mean, you needed 8 Redstone tanks. So we had a real production line for Redstones. And then the von Braun team was requested to build a 1,500 nautical mile ballistic missile, which we termed the Jupiter. And so we set up a Jupiter production line, and we made that transition from the Army to NASA on June 30th, 1960. Everybody went to sleep, Army employees, and you work up July 1, 1960 as a NASA employee. And it really didn't change much for a year. I mean, we still did Redstones and Jupiters and early Saturn I first stages. And but a year later, roughly, in I believe it was around April of '61, when Kennedy announced the lunar program, and certainly after that thing was where things got very different. And when we became NASA, the military actually took everybody out of here. And von Braun was given spaces, but he had to go recruiting in a way for personnel and finance and legal counsel and all of that business. And von Braun decided that he needed to have a senior staff, somewhat analogous to a chief of staff in the military. And von Braun asked Hans Maus, the head of manufacturing, to be his chief of staff. And Hans Maus asked me to go along, so I joined von Braun's staff very shortly after Kennedy announced the lunar program, and I stayed in that organization all the way till '69 after the first lunar landing. Of course, that was a big deal, and we immediately discovered that we couldn't really continue on as an in-house manufacturer, because we had all these big stages that we had to get under contract, and so we had to kind of think about that, and we came up with a scheme of technical working groups on every discipline, many separate disciplines, and because we certainly initially we had McDonnell Douglas on S4B stage, but eventually we had Boeing and North American Rockwell on the first and second stage as a Saturn V, and IBM on the instrument unit. And so these technical working groups were trying to make some standardization across the way and among all the different stages. And Hans Miles actually asked me to head up a group on manufacturing. And just to discuss or show the power of the laboratories versus the program office, there was a gentleman here by the name of Oswald Lange, who was the head of the program offices. And Oswald Lange thought I was too young and inexperienced, but Hans Miles wrote him a short note that said, essentially, you are informed that Jay Foster is the chairman of the manufacturing working group. And it was sort of, and of course, over time that had to change, but and the program office became more powerful. There was, of course, some power struggles, if you will, but on the other hand, everybody was part of the team, and everybody really wanted to be part of the team and be productive, and to be able to do what had to be done and what everybody felt was what Von Braun wanted done. I mean, the team was very loyal to the man, and it was very interesting to watch. Saturn I was, in a way, somewhat of a learning experience, and we really didn't have a lot of major payloads, certainly not payloads that would affect the Saturn V. But the Saturn 1B, we flew 6 Saturn 1Bs that had a direct impact on Saturn V. We had command modules, service modules, and lunar excursion modules in. They're not complete. They're not really boilerplate. I mean, they were kind of the state of the art during the development of those 3 major elements from the Johnson Center. But we flew those things in Earth orbit and Earth vicinity. I'll take that terminology. And we demonstrated restart capability on both the service module and on the S4B stage, which essentially was identical between the second stage on the 1B and the third stage on the Saturn V. And we also tested the command module at its approximating the speed returning from the moon. When it returns from the moon, it's coming in at close to 25,000 miles an hour, and we came close to that by powering the command module with the service module. We use the service module really as an accelerator, and so we came close so we could test that, and we could then, after separation from the service module, you could turn it around and you could test the heat shield at those high speeds. And we also tested the lunar excursion module. I mean, we could pick some level in the atmosphere and say that's the lunar surface, and we could fire up the lunar landing stage, and we could pretend we're landing at that level and then immediately fire up the lunar takeoff stage. So we were testing the command module, service module, lunar excursion module, and the third stage of the Saturn V in those 6 Saturn 1Bs, which really later when we came to the first unmanned flight of Saturn V and management headquarters came up with the terminology of all up. I mean, it was all up in the sense that all the various elements were there, but the only new elements was the first and second stage of the Saturn V, because all of the upper stage elements had had some form of actual testing in near-Earth space. One major critical path, of course, was the engine, the big F1 engine, and the turbo pumps. turbo pumps, as I recall, operated like at 3,000 RPM and 2,000 PSI. And when they were pumping that fuel into the combustion chamber, they were always a problem. I mean, we were always having difficulty because they had turbine blades. I mean, they were turbines, and you had turbine blades and a lot of different problems. We had a combustion instability problem. And in the early days, we had pogo. We had fluid in the tanks creeping up the sides of the tanks. And so we came up with a temporary solution, what we call beer cans. They weren't beer cans. They were approximately the size of beer cans, but they were very clean aluminum. And we used them on the top of the fluid, which tend to damp out the perturbations, and that worked. Eventually, a permanent solution was we put blockage on the sides of the tank so that the fluid couldn't ride up the sides of the tank. It kept periodically hitting these modules that were sticking out from the side of the tank. A major decision was kind of tough. The very first Saturn one, the all-up Saturn V, went remarkably clean. It was everything was pretty smooth, almost no anomalies of any sort, and that was very encouraging. The second Saturn V, a few months later, had problems. We had pogo. We had fairly severe pogo. We had all 5 engines of the second stage started, but 2 of them shut down early. And also on the third stage, it failed to restart. And so this was rather worrying. On the other hand, we had good telemetry data, and we concluded that we really knew how to fix these problems. So NASA headquarters and all 3 of the center directors, Marshall, Houston, Kennedy, all signed on to the fact that we declared the Saturn V man-rated after that second unmanned flight. And then the third flight, we actually put men on board, and that was a circumlunar flight. And we got the message from the astronauts on Christmas Eve while they were circling around the moon. And that was on the third flight and the first manned flight of the Saturn V. I had gone down to the Cape with my family, and we were in that area, in the area rather far away from the vehicle, which is really determined by a military quantity distance. You take the equivalent of TNT, of all that propellant, and it tells you how far you need to stay away to be safe. But anyway, we were out in that group, and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy was there. And he gave us a speech, and his speech was rather negative. I mean, he was arguing the case that the money spent in space should have been spent to help the poor individuals around the country. And afterwards, I talked to him for a little bit, and I actually offered him some. I had a can of peanuts. I offered him some peanuts. He didn't accept them, but anyway, I had a little discussion with Ralph Abernathy, which, quite frankly, we were working a lot of long hours and really shoulder to the wheel type of thing, and we really didn't pay an awful lot of attention to most of the kinds of things going around the country. I mean, we saw it on television every night and that type of thing, but at the same time, it really didn't intersect much with our work. The one specific thing that really did involve us was trying to hire more minorities and this type of thing, and we did try to do that quite a bit. And one thing that people don't completely understand is, for instance, the Alabama A&M, they didn't really graduate engineers. They graduated engineering technologists. And if you really looked in, and I don't know how their curriculum is today, but if you really looked into their curriculum at that time, they were missing about 2 or plus or minus really key courses that would have made them, quote, engineers. And so that's one side, pushing to hire these individuals. And there were a lot of good individuals in that group. But then on the other side, the civil service regulations, you couldn't hire them as engineers. Engineering technologists didn't quite match. And so one side of the government is saying you can't hire them, and the other side of the government is saying, hey, hire them. And so this was real trouble. We did do 2 things, I think, as a counterpoint. We did send recruiting people down to South America, and we did bring back or hired a number of engineers from South America. Not enough to satisfy necessarily NASA headquarters, but at least we made that effort. And we had a computer expert, a black computer expert at that time by the name of Clyde Foster. And we gave Clyde Foster a 2-year sabbatical, and he went to Alabama A&M, and he established a computer department and a computer degree program at Alabama A&M. He did come back later and continued working here at Marshall, but we thought that 2-year sabbatical for Clyde Foster was very helpful, and I think it certainly helped with Alabama A&M becoming, in sort of a major way in the area, computer experts. Wow. Alabama A&M was always very interested. I mean, they thought that the computer department was one thing, but they also encouraged their professors and others at A&M to come up with experiments to fly. So I think Alabama A&M was very interested at that point, and still are. He never completely agreed that things were impossible. You know, they were, some things took longer to accomplish than others, and it took you longer to find a solution to go around something that was impossible, but you know, he was always very optimistic. And he also, in his management style, he really wanted to hear the ideas from everybody. You know, he, as part of his management technique, he had developed what he called a board meeting, a board of directors. Government organizations don't have boards of directors like industry, but he invented one. And it was fairly big. It had director and deputy director of each of the laboratories, and it had a sprinkling, a fairly big sprinkling of the next level down from the lab directors, division chiefs within the laboratory. A division chief normally was the head of a technology like optics or computational fluid dynamics or stress. And so he wanted those guys there. And he also, depending on the agenda of the meeting, this board meeting, it met regularly monthly, but it could meet at any time. And the problems that you wanted, he wanted somebody put up on the board. Originally, these were paper charts. They eventually got more into view graphs and stuff. But you could put up there the 1 or 2 problems that you wanted to discuss at this meeting, and then you could put the 2 or 3 potential solutions to that problem with the pros and cons for each potential solution. And then he opened it up to the group to discuss. And those meetings could last for 1 or 2 hours or 1 or 2 or 3 days, depending on the magnitude of the problem. And Werner really wanted to hear from everybody, and in particular, he wanted the experts on that subject in the room. And they weren't necessarily members of the board, but he wanted them from wherever they were in the bowels of the organization, or in some cases, they were at the contractor's plant. And so he would like to have them there because he wanted to hear what they said. Not that you would necessarily accept it, but you wanted to hear what the experts had to say about the particular subject. And Werner had about an 8-inch block of walnut and a gavel. And when the discussion unwinds, if you will, he would stand up and he would repeat or summarize his understanding of the way the whole group was leaning, And but then before he pounded that gavel and said, you know, this is the way we're going to go, he would look around the room one last time, and you know, anybody have any last minute comment? And you know, when everybody had really had their say, and in effect everybody was agreeing with the direction that Werner summarized, and it really was a summary from the group. And then he would finally pound his gavel on that walnut block, and that was a decision for the day. He had a staff luncheon group. You know, if he was here, he was always in that. If he wasn't here, and he did do a lot of traveling, his two deputies, Eberhard Rees on the technical side and Harry Gorman on the management side, they had this staff luncheon with all the direct reports. And as I recall, it was like 16 or so direct reports. And so you had, in a way, it was a bit of a tough luncheon. You know, there's 16, 18 people sitting around this table, and the discussion was flowing around, and then all of a sudden somebody asks a question or makes a comment that affects your area, and suddenly you got the ulcer lunch. You know, you suddenly got this question and you're on a hot seat. But on the other hand, all the key people in the organization tended to know pretty much everything that's really going on in the organization, and at least at a senior level, and particularly Hans Maus and I being in the staff, the executive staff type thing, it was particularly beneficial to us to really know what was going on more or less across the total organization. Yeah, but it's a little bit that you don't really know until you get there type of thing. That man historically has always clamored around the edges of technology. I mean, you go all the way back to, you know, the beginnings of time. I mean, you know, you go to like Christopher Columbus exploring and that type of thing. You know, after the first lunar landing, things relaxed a bit, and von Braun took his family and went on vacation, and they were gone for, I don't remember exactly how long, 2 or 3 weeks. And while he was gone, somehow it leaked out of Washington that he was planning to leave Huntsville. And it turned out that Tom Paine, the NASA administrator, he could see the end of the production line, if you will. I mean, we didn't turn Saturn V's out like automobiles by the millions. We flew eventually 13 Saturn V's, 12 under the banner of Apollo and 1 under the banner of Skylab. And but after the first successful lunar landing, Tom Paine could see the thing running down there, and so he knew Werner liked to dream a bit, and he also knew that Marshall, we had a advanced project office, and then we had done a lot of long-range planning or thinking in the long-range area for the manned part of the program. So Tom Paine had asked Werner to come to Washington. Nobody in town had really known about that, but it somehow came loose during Werner's absence. But there was some backing to tell everybody the fact that he was leaving, but he wasn't here. He's off on his vacation, and of course then he obviously talked about the fact that he was really going to go, and then he asked me to join him, and there was one other, Frank Williams. So Frank Williams and I and von Braun from Huntsville went up there, and Tom Paine had given us roughly 15 spaces. And we divided our little organization into 3 groups. One group was, well, we hired a gentleman from Rocketdyne, and his little group was to look into propulsion. What kind of engines, propulsion systems would we have in the year 2000? I mean, we were supposed to be looking at a long-range plan of what NASA ought to look like in the year 2000. The center group, headed up by Frank Williams, was put together a program. I mean, how many times are we going to go back to the moon? How many times are we going to go to Mars, and this type of thing? It's like Tinker Toys blocks. You're putting these various things in there to put together a program. And then the third block, under Jim Skaggs, we hired from headquarters, Jim Skaggs was supposed to put cost and schedule together, which that's a little dicey when you're talking about programs 30 years forward yet, or from '69 to 2000. And but anyway, we did all that, and then Tom Paine and Werner wanted to have a long weekend, and they picked the Wallops Space Flight Center, and there were 24 individuals that they invited to the Wallops for a long weekend to dream about the future, to talk about the future. And most of these individuals got up and talked about how they saw the future. Arthur Clarke was asked to be the keynote speaker here. And my remembrance of Arthur Clarke was he made a nice speech. He talked about, the vagaries of science fiction. And then he sat down, and for the rest of the period, he was sitting there, but then he was, I felt, was extremely quiet, because here's the real experts getting up and talking about the real future. And, he had just talked about the fictional future. And so he was really very quiet. But at the end of this, I think it was a 5-day weekend, we had lunch, and early in the day, they had got the 24 individuals together and had taken a picture of the group. And during lunch, they passed around 24 original pictures. And all 24 of us signed 24 pictures. So all 24 of us have a original picture with all those signatures on it. And that's, in a way, is one of the best keepsakes I have from a career with NASA. Well, we put together the long-range plan into a little pocketbook-sized book. Tom Paine took that to Mr. Nixon. Nixon was really not interested and told Tom Paine he had a lot on his plate, both in space and in aeronautics, and that he should go work on his plate. And very shortly after that meeting, Tom Paine jumped ship. He went to General Electric as a vice president in charge of their nuclear program. And von Braun also jumped ship. He decided to go to Fairchild Industries. And Mrs. Gandhi at the time and the president of Fairchild put Werner on the road in India. Fairchild had a program with NASA at that time to put an educational TV satellite in synchronous orbit over India. And Mrs. Gandhi also at the time purchased a fairly sizable number of bicycle-driven generators. You could put a bicycle-driven generator in a little area, in a little village, and people could take turns pumping the bicycle and then sit around in a circle in front of the TV and pull in the educational program. Von Braun knew, at the time actually left Huntsville, that he had cancer. And over the time, that thing really, of course, got worse. He died in '77. He was only 65 at the time. And I've often wondered what the space program would look like if he'd hung around to another 20 years or so. I'm 87 today. And if he'd have lived to 87, I think the space program would have been somewhat different. I was back here working at Marshall, and von Braun was on the board of directors of a bank in Decatur. And at that time, I was going back and forth to Washington quite a bit. And I got on the airplane to go to Washington, and there was Werner sitting in first class. And he invited me to sit down and chat with him, which I did. And then pretty soon the stewardess came by and looked at my ticket and said, "Sir, you have to sit back and coach." And that was fine. The flight wasn't completely full, so Werner got up and came back and coached with me. And we chatted all the way to Washington. I had a couple of hours, and that was the last time I saw him.